Great. Well, thank you very much for making it to the last presentation of the day. I'd like to start with some thank yous. So thank you to the organisers, to everyone here at the National Museum of Bermuda, and to everyone from the Naval Dockyard Society. It's great to be back here in Bermuda, and I'm reminded of Mark Twain's famous quote, "You can go to heaven if you want to, I'd rather stay in Bermuda." So now to begin. The Royal Naval Dockyard in Bermuda has been transformed over the last 75 years. Its role has changed from being an important imperial outpost for naval ship repairs to being a major tourist destination, especially for the cruise industry. This dramatic shift has been encapsulated in two contrasting stories from the Royal Gazette, Bermuda's oldest media outlet. Front page coverage on the 31st of March, 1951, referred to the hauling down of the White Ensign, the Royal Navy's departure, and the end of a chapter of British naval history dating back to the early 1800s. Only last month, there was a very different ceremony at the Dockyard, when a plaque was presented to the captain of the cruise ship Explorer 1 to mark her first visit to Bermuda and the Dockyard. Online coverage on the 7th of April 2025 referred to the 705 tourists on board and numerous passengers strolling through the historic Dockyard. However, the juxtaposition of such articles, redolent with symbolism about the Royal Navy leaving and a cruise ship arriving, suggests an inaccurate and simplistic transition. The development of the Dockyard has been far from straightforward. At times, change has been controversial, and the growth of tourism has not been linear. A more nuanced assessment of the Dockyard's recent history is required. This paper analyses how and why the Royal Naval Dockyard has changed since the Royal Navy left the main dockyard and stopped repairing ships in Bermuda in 1951. It draws upon speeches from the UK's House of Commons and Bermuda's House of Assembly, media coverage, and tourism statistics to show how decisions were reached, how they were received, and their consequences from the 1950s onwards. This research complements the existing literature about dockyard history and heritage, the heritage tourism nexus, and the impact of the cruise industry, which is increasingly attracting the attention of academics, particularly because of its outsized environmental footprint. By focusing on the Royal Naval Dockyard in Bermuda, this paper illustrates a powerful case study to show the complexity and difficulties of heritage tourism and the double-edged nature of cruise tourism. In terms of the historiography, as highlighted by Anne Coates, dockyards have not attracted a great deal of mainstream academic attention. The literature that does exist broadly falls into three categories, focusing on the built environment, the workforce, and social geography, heritage. It does not focus on the transformation of dockyards into modern waterfronts and tourist destinations. In the case of Bermuda and the Royal Naval Dockyard, historians have also focused their attention on the imperial period and previous centuries, including Edward Harris's book about Bermuda's forts and Anne Coates' study of enslaved workers in the 1790s and the Bermudian apprentices up to 1950. The book Bermuda Sentinel, the Royal Naval Base 1795 to 1950 by Jonathan Code is currently in press. Much as the dockyard's buildings were neglected for 20 odd years after the Royal Navy left, the period from the 1950s onwards has been neglected in the historiography. This paper will address this shortcoming by focusing on the latest chapter from the 1950s to today. As well as adding to the historiography of Bermuda, it also adds to wider debates about heritage, tourism, and the cruise industry. These are increasingly controversial and contemporary topics. Last year, a special issue of the journal Tourism Economics was dedicated to heritage, tourism, and local development. Similarly, this research provides case study data to expand upon John Tunbridge's cautionary tale about selling heritage for tourism. and Ross Klein's seminal book entitled Cruise Ship Blues, The Underside of the Cruise Ship Industry. First of all, a brief history is required to provide some context to the changes and their consequences in Bermuda's Royal Naval Dockyard in modern times. So we'll start in the 1940s when this photo was taken. You can see here that the number of battleships. During World War II, the dockyard was vital to the Allies' success in the Atlantic. It serviced nearly 600 ships and was the home of critical anti-submarine training and helped maintain supply lines across the Atlantic for American, British, and Canadian forces. This was when the dockyard was still known as a bastion of imperial naval defense and the Gibraltar of the West. However, despite making a major contribution to the Allied victory, soon after the conflict, the dockyard's ship repairing function was redundant. In early 1950, the British government announced its momentous decision to close the Royal Naval Dockyard, which still employed 1,200 men. It was uneconomic to upgrade the dated facilities to cater for modern warships and their electrical equipment. This was a turning point in the nexus between the Royal Navy, the British Empire, and the dockyard, a long-standing association that dated back to 1809 when the Royal Naval Dockyard was first established. Considering its prominent position within Bermuda, the Royal Navy's departure from the dockyard's repair yards was swift and dramatic. The closure was announced in Bermuda's House of Assembly on the 13th of April, 1950, and the dockyard officially closed on the 31st of March the following year. The Royal Navy did not just leave its ship repairing facilities, it disemboweled the dockyard. Special arrangements were made to send men and materiel to the UK. Stores were either returned to the UK, sold in Bermuda, or dumped. Front page coverage from the Royal Gazette on the day of the closure referred to deserted wharves, the transfer and sale of stores and equipment, and the end of a local chapter of British naval history. See here, front page of the Gazette, the story about the closure of the dockyard featured prominently, although I appreciate you probably can't see that at the back of the room. Captain Lean, appropriate name maybe, who had been appointed to liquidate HMS Malabar, the Royal Navy's name for the dockyard, claimed that the Royal Navy was not abandoning Bermuda, but it certainly felt that way from the article, especially as he confirmed that the large floating dock would be moved. The progress of the 22,000-ton floating dock, one of the largest in the world, attracted the attention of the British press on its 2,500-mile journey from Bermuda to Falmouth, towed by 3 of the Royal Navy's strongest tugs. And this attracted attention from the Evening News, the paper in Portsmouth. So we have front page coverage here, farewell to Bermuda, about the movement of the floating dock, and floating dock's long tow a couple of weeks later. So it was continually, its updates were continually shared in the British press. 49 apprentices from the dockyards were sent to Portsmouth to complete their apprenticeships, and others completed their training at Chatham and Plymouth. After its closure, no repair facilities were available in Bermuda. The dockyard reverted to its previous role, one not held since the early 1800s, of being fleet anchorage. In a House of Commons debate, Walter Edwards MP, Civil Lord of the Admiralty, declared unconvincingly that the strength of the America and West Indies squadron would not be affected by the closure of the dockyard. All repairs and refits were to be carried out by home yards in the United Kingdom. The Royal Navy's minimal presence continued over the next few decades. In 1953, the Bermudian government purchased the Royal Naval Dockyard and other land in Bermuda for £750,000. The next 20 years saw the majority of the vast dockyard complex fall into disrepair. Damaged by the North Atlantic elements, rampant vegetation, and neglect, the dockyard was deserted and was a shadow of its former self. In 1995, the Royal Navy's base, which had been kept for visiting naval ships from the UK and its allies, was closed. Our focus now shifts from the Royal Navy to tourist attractions. Bermuda's association with and dependence upon international tourism has a storied history. Ever since the end of World War I, visitors have been drawn to the island for many reasons, including its favorable climate, natural beauty, and proximity to the US, Canada. During the era of Prohibition, Bermuda was known as one of the destinations for booze cruises. For decades, international tourism was the island's main source of income, only being overtaken by the international business sector, particularly reinsurance, in the 1990s. Bermuda has been characterized as an upmarket, microstate resort destination, catering to high-income visitors. From small beginnings, the Dockyard has played an important and growing part within Bermuda's panoply of tourist attractions. The tide turned in the Dockyard's favor in 1974, when the Bermuda Maritime Museum was opened in the Keep. It was the result of tireless efforts by founders including Jack Arnell and Andrew Trimmingham and an army of volunteers, and it quickly gained traction and attention. In 1978, Bermuda's Parliament passed an act charging the museum with restoring the buildings of the Keep and collecting, preserving, researching, and exhibiting Bermuda's maritime history. In 1982, the Bermudian government created the West End Development Corporation, WEDCO, to develop the Dockyard. More than $60 million was invested in the area to transform it into a tourist attraction. And we can see here the restored Dockyard, complete with visiting yachts, and me, my previous visit. In 1999, Dolphin Quest arrived in the Dockyard, giving tourists the opportunity to swim with dolphins within the lagoons of the Keep. According to the National Museum of Bermuda's website, the Dockyard had become the most visited site in Bermuda by 2001. The Dockyard traded on its heritage and thrill-seeking attractions, as well as less cultural and more sedate activities, including shopping and eating out. The late 20th century had witnessed an expansion in tourism to Bermuda's 3 cruise destinations, Dockyard, Hamilton, and St. George's. And this cruise ship here is overshadowing buildings in St. George's. However, as Martha Honey has shown, unusually for a destination dependent upon tourism, Bermuda's government also sought to regulate cruise tourism. Agreed in 1989, the cruise policy package introduced a number of restrictions, including limiting cruise arrivals to 6,000 passengers a day and banning cruise ships from arriving at the weekends. Cruise ship arrivals in Bermuda dipped below their 1989 figure for 3 years before a significant increase in 1993. In 1999, Bermuda introduced a $60 tax per cruise passenger, applicable from April to October, the highest cruise passenger fee in the world. Nonetheless, such cautious approaches were short-lived. In the first decade of the new millennium, there was another shift as policies and investments favored the cruise industry, particularly the facilities at Dockyard. Bermuda's courting of the cruise ship industry was successful. Whereas there were more visitor arrivals by air than cruise ship until 2005, this balance shifted thereafter. In 2009, a new wharf was opened to allow a second cruise ship to berth at the Dockyard. So these before and after photos show King's Wharf here on its own, and then King's Wharf and Heritage Wharf. Yeah, this is a close-up of cruise ship at Heritage Wharf. It's no accident that it is called Heritage Wharf. Its proximity to the Keep and us here at the National Museum of Bermuda is exceptional and must be unique in terms of a combined transport and heritage hub. In 2011, Bermuda's main cruise ship facilities were moved from St. George's in the east of Bermuda to King's Wharf in the Dockyard. Today, Dockyard is the busiest port in Bermuda, catering for 92% of cruise ship calls made to the island in 2024. As well as accommodating cruise ship passengers, the Dockyard also maximizes its maritime heritage and location. The three-masted Spirit of Bermuda, a replica of a 19th century Royal Navy sloop of war, is berthed at Dockyard and can be visited by tourists. In 2017, the Dockyard hosted the America's Cup, the greatest race in the sailing calendar. As the Dockyard's facilities and attractions have improved and expanded since the 1970s, tourist numbers have increased. Now home to cultural and leisure attractions across its 24 acres, it caters for 500,000 visitors a year. The National Museum of Bermuda, known as the Bermuda Maritime Museum until 2013, is one of the most popular attractions within the Dockyard. Its visitor numbers have nearly tripled since its early years in the mid-1970s. I'm not sure you can read the figures at the back there, but in 1975, 24,500 visitors, and then last year in 2024, over 71,000 visitors. Today, the preservation and development of the museum's 15-acre site at the keep and the surrounding areas is a symbol of the successful regeneration of the Dockyard. However, the overall trajectory of ever-increasing visiting numbers to one of the main attractions in the Dockyard is misleading. It masks significant fluctuations, short-term trends, and plateaus. According to figures taken every 10 years, visitor numbers hardly rose between 1984 and 1994, and numbers fell in 2014 following 2 hurricanes in Bermuda and extensive damage to the museum. Now, this slide shows the statistics for more recent years, both the number of total visitors, which is the line at the top here, and those arriving by cruise ship. So total visitor numbers are rising again following the fallow COVID-affected years of 2020 and 2021, but they have not yet reached the peak achieved in 2018. When it comes to cruise ship passengers visiting the museum, the reality is even more complicated. Since 2011, when cruise ship passenger data was first collected, numbers have fluctuated considerably. There is no discernible trend, apart from the last 3 years when year-on-year numbers have increased significantly following the collapse of the cruise industry during the travel restrictions of the COVID era. Cruise ship passengers also represent a significant proportion of the museum's total visitors, often accounting for more than 40% of its annual visitors. Bermuda relies heavily upon international tourism to generate income and employment. Cruise ship tourism is the dominant form of such tourism, and the Dockyard accommodates the vast majority of these ships and their foreign visitors. Therefore, the Dockyard is disproportionately affected by cruise ship calls, cruise passenger numbers, and policy towards cruise tourism. Bermuda's government has successfully championed the cruise ship industry and its expansion within the Dockyard. In a House of Assembly debate in November 2010, Zane De Silva MP defended the government's expenditure on Heritage Wharf at the Dockyard, saying that cruise ships would not have visited Bermuda without this investment. He challenged the opposition's objections. De Silva said, "We heard many times the opposition talk about, oh, we don't want cruise passengers here, the hamburger and French fries crowd. Well, Mr. Speaker, tell our taxi drivers that. Tell all the restaurants in Bermuda that. Tell all the folks that have their sunfishes and their jet skis and that type of business, Mr. Speaker. Tell them that. I think you will find that we have a different story coming from those folks, Mr. Speaker." 12 years later, the sentiment from the government benches was very similar. Addressing Bermuda's House of Assembly in 2022, Wayne Furbert MP, Minister of Transport, celebrated the expansion of cruise ship calls and their rising economic impact. He compared 123 ship calls and their economic impact of $67 million in 2013 with 184 ship calls and their economic impact of $170 million in 2019. He detailed how government policy had encouraged more overnight stays, increased calls in the off-peak season, and raised cruise passenger tax. Furbert said, "The cruise ship dollar touches the lives of everyday public service vehicle operators, retail and restaurant employees, tour boat operators, tour guides, lifeguards, artists, and sightseeing attractions, and much, much more." A year later, in 2023, Furbert welcomed the arrival of the MSC Meraviglia, one of the world's largest cruise ships, at Heritage Wharf in the Dockyard. On its inaugural sailing from New York to Bermuda, she had more than 5,000 cruise passengers on board. The cruise companies have responded favorably to Bermuda's investments in its cruise facilities and its wider attractions. The island has often been marketed alongside Caribbean destinations, and the Dockyard is one of the highlights in cruise tourism advertising. The Royal Naval Dockyard, Bermuda, appears in a list of Caribbean and Southern Caribbean ports on a webpage for MSC Cruises. Royal Caribbean's website reads, "Discover a history-filled paradise full of pink sand beaches with a cruise to Bermuda. Explore colonial landmarks like the Royal Navy Dockyard." They refer to Navy, not Naval Dockyard, so it's immediately apparent that accuracy is not their strong point. The Dockyard also appears in the opening and closing scenes of Experience Bermuda, a promotional video produced by Royal Caribbean International. P&O Cruises include Bermuda in a list of Caribbean ports, and the Dockyard, with its Georgian-style keep, is described as intriguing to explore. Including Bermuda within the Caribbean category is a helpful shorthand for marketeers, and there is a logic to it given the similarity between island life, history, and culture in Bermuda and the Caribbean islands. However, geographically, Bermuda is 900 miles north of the Caribbean. Its isolated position in the North Atlantic means that a cruise to Bermuda is a different prospect to a Caribbean holiday. Cruises from North America to Bermuda are normally single destination holidays, with a number of nights spent at the Dockyard in Bermuda rather than the island hopping itineraries of Caribbean cruises. Enthusiasm for cruise ship tourism in Bermuda, however, is far from universal. Controversy has long surrounded the economic impact of cruise ship tourism and how such largesse is distributed. According to Martha Honey, the profits from cruise tourism remain modest compared with Bermuda's stayover tourism. The cruise ships staying overnight in Dockyard compete directly with local hotels. Cruise ships dominate the seascape and skyline from April to October. We have some examples of such cruise ships on the slide. We don't really need them when you can see them outside. These are for our virtual remote audience. But ship calls are infrequent outside the peak season. Cruise passenger numbers automatically generate millions for government coffers in tourist taxes, but their presence does not always translate into significant income for local businesses. As reported in the Royal Gazette in October 2024, Heidi Cohen, administrator of the Dockyard Arts Centre, has called cruise passenger numbers a great illusion. Boyd Vallis, owner of a store in Dockyard, has agreed, describing cruise passengers as $5 magnet people. Maz Shabdeen, a restaurant owner in Dockyard, has said few of the passengers on MSC cruises leave the ship when it is in port, citing the older demographic as a factor. Cruise ship tourism is also associated with the inevitable challenges of operating at sea. Despite being tranquil for most of the year, Bermuda is vulnerable to occasional hurricanes and storms, and these bad weather events can disrupt cruise ship schedules. The risks posed by the complexity of large cruise ships, the high numbers of passengers, and the power of the winds and waves are also noteworthy. The Nordic Empress cruise ship suffered an engine room fire and loss of power in 2001 while 140 miles from Bermuda en route to New York. Engineers managed a temporary fix, and the ship and its 1,500 passengers and 650 crew limped back to St. George's. Its passengers were returned to Bermuda and flew home. In 2015, the Norwegian Dawn cruise ship, carrying nearly 3,500 passengers and crew, ran aground on a reef close to Bermuda. It was stuck for 6.5 hours before the rising tide set it free. Environmental problems, both at sea and in port, are another downside of the cruise ship industry. In 1992, an oil spill in St. George's Harbour in the east of Bermuda was linked to the cruise ship Nordic Prince. Royal Caribbean, the ship's operator, was fined $8,500 by Bermuda's government for this breach of environmental regulations. In 2006, the Norwegian Crown cruise ship hit a coral reef off Bermuda. A study of the impact site less than 48 hours after the ship was refloated showed high levels of copper and zinc contamination from the anti-fouling paint scraped off the ship's hull. The carbon emissions associated with cruise ships are also a significant problem, both at sea and when they are in port. By continuing to run their power-hungry systems during port calls, they contribute to local air pollution. In conclusion, the Royal Naval Dockyard has been transformed from being a vital cog in the machinery of imperial defence to being a tourist attraction aimed at the cruise market. This dramatic development has previously been overlooked by scholars. This paper has shown how the changes have not been straightforward and their consequences remain controversial. While acknowledging Bermuda's unique position as an island in the North Atlantic, this case study also offers a model to study the modern development and repurposing of other imperial dockyards, including Gibraltar and other dockyards in the Caribbean. The growth of cruise ship tourism has undoubtedly contributed to the renaissance of the dockyard, including the preservation of its cultural heritage and creation of leisure facilities. However, cruise passengers are currently not the panacea for the dockyard and are accompanied by uneven and seasonal patterns of tourism. Moreover, many do not engage in the dockyard's cultural offerings, and their spending on the island is limited, especially as they have already purchased all-inclusive packages and are therefore incentivized to stay on their cruise ship for food and entertainment. One fundamental question remains. 75 years after the Royal Navy left the dockyard's history and heritage, how can the dockyard's history and heritage be reinvigorated and reinterpreted to inspire visitors for the next 75 years? Thank you.